Okay, I am in Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 7. And in this message, I'll be covering Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. In this chapter, in this section here, we have a continuation from Hebrews chapter 5. A continuation from Hebrews chapter 5. What happened was that he was getting ready to speak about Melchizedek, and then he paused. The author paused and spent time talking about the issues that I presented from Hebrews chapter 6. But now we are returning to the subject of Melchizedek that ended at Hebrews chapter 5. So in Hebrews chapter 5, let me review this for just a moment. I'm going to start in verse 8. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8. It says, "Though he was a son," referring to Jesus, "yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, and having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him." And then in verse 10, "called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing." And I explained in this passage when I spoke on this before, in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11, that the idea of becoming dull of hearing normally has to do with that transition when you go from this is amusing to this is annoying. When that transition takes place, then we usually call that dull of hearing. That at the beginning, people find it amusing, interesting, but then after a while it just gets annoying, and then they don't want to hear anything about it anymore. All right, but here in verse 10, Hebrews chapter 5, verse 10, he says, "called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek." And then in verse 11, "of whom we have much to say." And then he pauses. It doesn't mean that he's not going to say anything. He is. He's got a lot to say. He's going to wait a little while, and he's going to present it in what we have here as chapter 7. That's when he returns to this subject of Melchizedek, and he explains a little bit more about the Lord Jesus through Melchizedek. Now, again, I want to remind you that I believe that it would be better in general to translate Melchizedek into King of Righteousness. That if you read through Hebrews and actually translate that word, that in many cases it gives you a much better rendition of what the writer is most likely intending to say. But as a person, we call him Melchizedek as the person. So this chapter, when people teach through this chapter or study through this chapter, in general in the Christian world, the way that people think of it is that they think of it as this is a chapter about tithing, or this section in Hebrews chapter 7, that's what this is supposedly really about. It's about tithing. And tithing in the sense that tithing was before the law of Moses. And the intent behind that is that if tithing was before the law of Moses, well, then tithing has to be after the law of Moses. Even though Jesus fulfilled the law, and the law is not necessarily a part of our life anymore, well, tithing was not necessarily a part of that. Not really a part of that, because it existed before Moses. It was something that was in place before Moses, in this case during the time of Abraham. That's how it's normally presented. And so this is going to be another one of those messages where I'm going to need to spend some time talking about what people normally teach, what they normally believe about this passage, so that I'm not distracting you from what I believe it really means. But through that, I'll explain why that is not the case. I'll be able to explain while going through this why this really has nothing to do with tithing. That's not really what it is about. But in order to understand that, you have to really study the passage and the relevant passages that give the background concerning this in Hebrews chapter 7. All right. So to begin with, I'm going to start in Genesis chapter 14. Okay. I'm going to go back to Genesis chapter 14, where we have the events that took place. and address it from there. In Hebrews chapter 14, what happened was that war took place. There were some kings who made war against a number of different groups. The king of Salem was one of them, I would say by default, because Abraham returned, or in this case he was known as Abram. He returned, I'm going to keep referring to him as Abraham though, returned wealth and people to the king of Salem. Melchizedek returned the people, and so by default I'm going to be able to say that war was made against him as well. But these kings went in and they took the stuff of these people. And I'll just focus on Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, the king of Salem, the king of peace. This particular king, what happened was that Abraham, these kings, they made war against these other kings and took their stuff and took their people. And Abraham, in response, Abraham went and made war against these kings. And when he did, he then won in the war, and he returned with the stuff and with the people, and he gave back some of the stuff. All right, I'll begin in verse 14, Hebrews chapter 14, verse 14. Now, when Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, that was Lot, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, and that is the King's Valley, after his return from the defeat of that guy. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name in English right now. And the kings who were with him. And then in verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. Now that's Abram giving Melchizedek a tithe of all that he had obtained. Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, yet lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with me. All right, and then he goes on from there. So what we have here is we have a description of Abraham making war, winning the war, returning, and then giving a tenth as a tithe to the king of righteousness, to Melchizedek, of all that he had plundered. That's what had happened. All right, so let me go back to Hebrews chapter 7. In Hebrews chapter 7, verse 1, it says, For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Right? So this is what's going on. Abraham made his war, reacquired the people and the stuff that were taken, and then he gives a tenth of the plunder to the king of righteousness, to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek is identified, and this is a quotation, partial quotation from Genesis as well. Melchizedek is identified as someone who is without father, without mother, and without the beginning or end of days, This could be considered to be a manifestation of the Lord Jesus? I personally don't think so. I think that there would need to be some more information available for us to be able to really determine that this is the case. I just don't, from what is given here, I don't think that there's enough to really go on to say that this is Jesus manifested in the flesh. This to me appears to be someone who was definitely a participant in the lives of the people at this time. All right. Now, in some cases in the scriptures, what is described is not necessarily a description of fact, but instead is a description of the perception of the people. All right. I'm not going to give you examples of this right now. That's not the purpose of this message. I'll just tell you that there are many places where these places can be better understood if you recognize that it's just simply a description of the perception of the people and not necessarily the reality of what was happening. All right, and I think that this is one of those circumstances. And I realize that this is not a popular Christian theological point of view. You can just call this part of my Pharisaical residue. That is just something that I have from a long history of study and research and time in my pursuit of the knowledge of God. And this is just how I approach this particular verse. Again, you don't have to agree with me. I'm not going to engage in a debate or an argument over this. This is just how I look at this. That in this case, it's just simply the perception of the people at that time. That Melchizedek, he was an important person. He obviously contributed a lot. But that it was the perception of the people that he didn't have a father and he didn't have a mother and nobody knew where he came from necessarily. They didn't know when he was born and they didn't know, that he would die anytime soon, that sort of thing. That it was a description of the people and their perception of him and how they saw him and what kind of regard that they had for him. All right. If it was the case that he had no end of days, then where is he? Come on, where is he? You would think that he would be around. Now, personally, I can understand that if he is around, he probably doesn't want anybody to know because somebody might try to kill him. That's understood from a lot of religious history that people do respond that way and react that way. So, on that basis, that can be understood. But even if he was around, I would expect that he's been around for a while. He's had plenty of time to think about a lot of things. And I would suspect that he would have some contributions to make when it comes to the discussions about our God and about the things of God and about the history that we have here described in the scriptures. I would think that he would have a lot to contribute to this. And I would expect that he would probably find a way to make these things known, to make these things available. And as far as I can tell, there isn't anybody in existence who is participating in the discussion or the conversation or the activity of the study of the living God in a way that would represent the King of the King of righteousness. I don't think that this is actually the case, that he was without beginning of days nor end of life, but that this was just the perception of the people at that time. All right, now, so continuing into Hebrews chapter 7, verse 4, it says, "Now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are the sons of Levi who receive the priesthood have a commandment to..." I'll come back to that in just a minute. Let's just consider what it says, that consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. All right, well, if he gave a tenth of the spoils, please understand this is not a tenth of his produce. It's not a tenth of his produce. It's not a tenth of the production of Abraham, of the animals that passed under the rod, stuff like that. It wasn't that at all. This was a portion of what he acquired in war. That's what he got. And so it was a tenth. It was a tithe, if we were to use that word, the official word, which really just means a tenth. that certainly did take place, but it was not a tenth of his produce. It was a tenth of the plunder that he recovered. All right? So it's important to recognize this. It's important to understand this if we're going to make a correlation between this and tithing. All right? If we were to make a more appropriate correlation with regards to this and tithing, then let's assume a more correct circumstance, or a more accurate circumstance, something that would be more compatible with this particular situation. Let's consider. Let's say that you were robbed. Somebody or a group of people invaded your home and they took a bunch of your stuff. Maybe you have some people living with you, children or friends or family or whatever, and they were taken too. And let's assume that you want them back. All right. Let's assume that you want them back. And this is serious. This is a traumatic experience that you've been robbed like that. Okay, but let's say that I go and I make war against these criminals. That this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go and I'm going to make war against these criminals. I do that and I win. Right? And back in those days, the way you won was you killed your enemy and you took all of his stuff. And you would also occupy the land. All right? So you're going to kill your enemy, you're going to take all of his stuff, and you're going to occupy the territory. Right? In modern times, in these days, it seems that wars are fought and concluded differently. But back then, that's how it happened. So if I was to do that, if I was to go and find these criminals, and I made war against them, and I killed them all, and I got all the stuff and all the people, and I came back, and let's say that I give you a tenth of the stuff that I took. All right? Well, I'll give you all the people. But, the stuff, I keep a tenth of the stuff. I give you a tenth, and I keep 90%. All right? I keep 90% of the stuff that I took. Right? Now, the kings there, they offered to Abraham, they offered him the rest of the tenth even. But my point is that if I did that, then I would give you a tenth of your stuff back, and I'll keep 9/10 of your stuff that was taken from you that I went and retrieved through warfare. Then that's the situation. That's what it would look like. All right, that's exactly what happened, and yet today, what people are saying is they're saying, this shows that the tithing was before the Mosaic Law. That's what they're saying. And that because of this, then you need to take a tenth of your produce and make sure that you give that to the appropriate representative of God. That's what you're supposed to do. But this has nothing to do with the events that took place. Nothing to do with it at all. And so really, the idea of tithing as it is presented today has nothing to do with what was described in Hebrews chapter 7. It has nothing to do with it at all. Even if you wanted to, who are you going to give it to? Where is Melchizedek? Where is he? He's not around. All right, he's just not here. And so these other people who are asserting themselves in your life in this way, they're trying to place themselves in the position of Melchizedek in this sense, to say that you should give your tithes to them. But don't worry, just as Melchizedek blessed Abraham, so also they will bless you. So if you pay them, if you give them a tenth of, not the plunder anymore, we're thinking a tenth of the produce, then don't worry, they will be there for you as the one who is greater than you are. These people, they are greater than you are, and they are the official people representatives of God, of the Most High. Yes, they are. And you will deliver. You will deliver of your produce to these people, and they will bless you in return. They will do that. Okay? And this is how people are relating to each other. This is what they're doing with each other these days. Okay, let me proceed into Hebrews chapter 7 from let's go to verse 5. And indeed, those who are of the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. All right, now the reason for the insertion of the Levites here is to say a number of things. The first thing is that they who have the commandment to receive tithes, they also gave tithes through Abraham to someone else. And so in effect, what the writer has done through verse 5 is he has stated that Melchizedek is in fact greater than the Levites, greater than the Levitical priesthood. To me, that is the value of verse 5, is to see that. But in addition to all of this and the surrounding verses, we can see that it is clear that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. In verse 6, but he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham, that's Melchizedek, whose genealogy is not derived, and blessed him who had the promises. And then in verse 7, now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the greater. All right, so please understand that what we have here in Hebrews chapter 7 is a way of stating that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham and the Levitical priesthood as well. Melchizedek is greater than the Levitical priesthood. Continuing into verse 8, here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. All right? So the value of this is that we can see through Hebrews chapter 7 that the writer is stating that Abraham was great. He certainly was. But there was someone who was greater than Abraham. All right? And that was Melchizedek. And in addition to that, Melchizedek was greater than the Levitical priesthood. But what is this really about? All right? Where is he really going with this? Well, the fact is that Jesus is of the order of Melchizedek. We know that. All right? The writer is made that clear. Jesus is of the order of he is of the order of the King of righteousness. He is in effect greater than Melchizedek. Jesus is greater than Melchizedek. This is a big deal. All right? Why? Well, it's not such a big deal that he's greater than Melchizedek, because Melchizedek isn't even around. All right? And so, and what did he do after that? And what was his role? Where and when? Okay, well, this was the role and this was the purpose of Melchizedek, period. And that was to be able to eventually say that there is someone greater than Melchizedek. That's what he's doing in the scriptures. That's why he showed up there in Genesis chapter 14. He showed up so that during this time in history, after what Jesus accomplished, and the writer describes what we have to say about Melchizedek, he was placed there so that our God could make it known, make it clearly known, that there is someone greater than Melchizedek, that Jesus is greater than Melchizedek. But that's not the really big deal. The really big deal is that by default, if he is greater than Melchizedek, then Jesus is greater than Abraham, and also greater than the Levitical priesthood. All right, now the writer does not openly say that. He doesn't say it directly. This is said indirectly, because to consider that there would be someone greater than Abraham, to consider that would be quite a challenge for the Jews, the recipients of this letter. That would be hard. That would be a big deal, because the very definition of our existence is according to the promises of Abraham, where God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky, that there would be a whole lot of them, and that they would always exist. And so this was a big deal, right? Abraham is for the most part considered to be the greatest of all. He is the one through whom our very existence is defined. In addition to that, Abraham was recognized as the friend of God. Moses was recognized as a friend of God as well, as God spoke to Moses as he would to a friend. But with Abraham, Abraham was known as a friend of God. And wouldn't we all like to be the friend of God? We would like to understand what that means, and people would like to grow into that. But Abraham was considered to be the greatest among all. And so for us to say, or for the writer to say, that Jesus is greater than Abraham, that would be difficult, very difficult for the people to embrace. And so the writer does this indirectly. That's what he's doing here in Hebrews chapter 7. It is not about tithing before the law, after the law. Do we tithe because we're not under the law? That kind of thing. All right, it has nothing to do with that at all. It all has to do with the writer explaining indirectly that Jesus is greater than Abraham. And he does so in an acceptable way that the people would embrace and understand and accept without it being such an obvious problem or an obvious concern. All right, and so what he's done is he's paused from the end of Hebrews chapter 5 to address some of the issues concerning the milk of the Scriptures, the meat of the Scriptures, the fact that we already have salvation, that we are here in order to teach others, those kinds of things that I explained from chapter 6. But this is still a continuation. He now returns after that pause, and this is a continuation of the theme of the letter to begin with. All right, that's what we have here. In Hebrews chapter 7, we return to the theme of how the letter was structured to begin with, and how it was read, how it was understood. Because if you can remember, in Hebrews chapter 1, he explained that Jesus is greater than the angels. Greater than the angels. And so if he's greater than the angels, we should take him seriously. And then in Hebrews chapter 3, he spends time speaking about Jesus as being greater than Moses. Greater than Moses. And so if he's greater than Moses, we should definitely take him seriously. And then in Hebrews chapter 5, that Jesus is greater than the high priest. Greater than the high priest. And so here in Hebrews chapter 7, right, chapter 1 is the angels, chapter 3 is Moses, chapter 5 is the high priest, and chapter 7, Jesus is greater than Melchizedek. And by default, greater than Abraham, and greater than the Levites. All right, than the Levitical priesthood. That's what we have here. All right, so again, in Hebrews chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, it says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave the 10th part of all, being first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually." All right, well, not continually because he's not around anymore. All right, but the Lord Jesus is definitely the Son of God, and he remains continually. He was executed through crucifixion, but he rose from the dead, and he is now functional and alive, and is doing just fine, and is continually serving us as our high priest, because he will never die. But all the others had to their priesthood end because death prevented them from continuing in office. All right, so that's what this is really about. This is not about how do we say that tithing is now right for us today. This is all about stating that that there was someone who was greater than Abraham, and Jesus is greater than that person, and so by default, he is greater than Abraham. All right, now, because of what Jesus has done for us, because of this, and he is the one who is our priest, he also blesses us. He blesses us, but not because we give him a tenth of anything, but he blesses us because of all that he has already done for us, and because we surrender to the new covenant. That's what defines and establishes our relationship with him, is the new covenant. And through the new covenant, we have a new relationship with him, such that he blesses us with all that we need for life and godliness. And our life and our pursuit of living our lives and experiencing godliness is really about discovering what we have already been blessed with, and discovering how we might be able to apply in our daily lives what has been given to us. But our interaction with him, because of his indwelling presence, and because we now have a new relationship that's possible, because he doesn't relate to us on the basis of our sin anymore, we now have a new opportunity for a communication between us, such that he's able to guide us and lead us and grow us and give us discernment concerning the things in our daily lives. All of this introduces an opportunity for us to effectively become the friend of God. That's what happens. And so just as Abraham was a friend of God because he believed God, that's why. He was righteous because he believed God, because the Lord shared things with him, and Abraham believed him. So also, and Abraham was a participant in the things that God was doing. So also we are able to respond to the truth that is given to us, and as we believe our God, then we are considered to be his friend. We are the friend of God, and he relates to us, and he allows us to be a participant in the things that he is doing, such as ministering to the saints, teaching others, as was described in Hebrews chapter 6, that we are now a friend of God, and this friendship can be developed and built and lived out. We are able to experience this as Abraham did, because of what Jesus did for us. And considering that Jesus is greater than Melchizedek and greater than Abraham, and he is the one who has defined this relationship, our friendship with our God will be greater than any friendship that he has ever had before. And of course, there is a lot that I have spoken about with regards to this in many other places when it comes to having a relationship with our God and living that out. I have that littered throughout the radio programs for Living God Ministries as an example. All right, so this is Hebrews chapter 7, and I'll close with this. This is just a good simple presentation of what we have here between verses 1 through 10. I do have a question for you, for those of you who are in your small groups and using this message for your studies, and that is, what does it mean to be the friend of God? I just gave a description of that. This is a good question for you guys to wrestle with and talk with a little bit. What does it mean to be the friend of God? If you're the friend of God, Abraham was the friend of God, Moses was the friend of God. What does that mean to be the friend of God? And of course, everyone's different. And so the friendship that he will have with different people will be different. And you may be able to speak a little bit about how you can relate to that and what it means to you personally to be a friend of God and how you would understand that in this stage in your growth in Christ Jesus. Okay? So I will continue into Hebrews chapter 7, verse 11 in the next message. All right? Thank you.